Greetings, everybody. This is pal Malcolm Tent going live here on the dreaded Facebook, and in theory archived forever and ever and ever, not only on my Facebook page but also on my YouTube channel, which I have thoughtfully provided a little handmade, hand-printed meme for you to refer to quite frequently throughout this video. I'm just going to take a real quick look at my handheld monitor here to make sure that I am indeed going out live, because with technology being what it is, I really have no faith at all that I am going out live. So just bear with me for 1/2 second while I check this thing and make sure that the stream is coming through. And once I'm satisfied with that, we can get right down to brass tacks. So bear with me for just 1/2 second. Keeping in mind this is archived forever and ever on the internet. It's part of my permanent record. Okay, well, everything I can see here says that I am live. We've got some people signed in, and I think we're ready to go. The name of the show is Tent Talks Tunes, and I do this every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on my Facebook page. And basically, I'm going to do something completely different from what I normally do on Tent Talks Tunes. Is I'm going to skip all the falderall and get right down to the meat of the matter, which is a deep dive into the psychology of GG Allin. Now, I've been a GG fan ever since I first heard of him in early 1987. I had a very friendly working relationship with him, and he is a subject that has fascinated me since the days of 1987. We're looking at about 40, the better part of 40 years now as of this speaking. And needless to say, he's a very fascinating subject. The fact that he died in 1993, and as I sit here in the year 2025, 32 years later, we're still talking about him, and you good people are actually watching and listening, shows that he had a lot of importance and he made a big impact on a lot of people. And so, keeping that in mind, I'd like to start by dedicating this webcast to all of the survivors out there. I want to dedicate this to all the people who I've met over the years, and there have been quite a few of them, who have used GG's music and GG's art as a tool to cope with hard times and to cope with rough lives and to cope with bad situations. There's a lot of people who take strength from GG's FU attitude and his refusal to be beaten down, and his refusal to ever quit or to ever stop. So all you survivors out there, I salute you. I also want to dedicate this webcast to everybody who loved GG for his music and his art and his creativity rather than just for the spectacle. The important thing that really can't be stressed enough is that if GG's music was no good, really nobody would care about him at all. And what first hooked me after seeing the outrageousness of his presentation was just how good his music was. And that's what I think keeps everybody, or at least myself, interested. And in my opinion, the people who are into it for the right idea are interested in the music. So big swig of Newton, North Carolina tap water to the people who loved him for his music. I'm going to stress, too, that what you're watching right now is 100% live, going out on Facebook and internet on my YouTube, archived on my YouTube channel. As you just saw, that was a genuine mistake. There is no AI, no post-production, no editing, no funny stuff. What you are seeing and hearing is exactly what I'm doing and saying, and when I'm done with this thing, it's going to go out there and be archived forever. And that's that. So fasten your seatbelts and put on your safety helmets, because we are in for about an hour or so dedicated to this topic. So I've noticed, being a child of the internet and a dude who's got his finger on the pulse of mass media and social media and all that, that there are quite a few internet psychiatrists and like types who have attempted to do their own analyses of GG. And I will say that a lot of them do a pretty good job, considering that all they have to go off of is basically a Wikipedia entry and maybe a little bit of cursory research based on a little bit of Googling. I want to say first and foremost that I am not a psychiatrist. I have no psychiatric training other than a couple of high school classes. But I've had a real lifetime interest in GG, and I've done a lot of reading, I've done a lot of research, and I've always had kind of a knack for psychiatric topics. So that's where I'm coming from. The most important aspect of this thing that I can bring to the table and present to you people that the internet psychologists don't have and can't offer is that I actually knew GG. I'm not ever going to say that we were the best of buddies. We didn't hang out. We weren't drinking pals. We weren't, bro hugs all the time, but we were friendly. We had a very friendly working relationship is the way that I describe my relationship with GG. I talked to him a lot on the phone. We corresponded quite a bit. I promoted a show of his in 1989 with his band, The Disappointments. I shot a video called The $20 Poem. I had a record store that sold his cassettes and videos and things like that. So we went back and forth an awful lot. And up until the middle of his first prison term, we were definitely cool and definitely friendly. So there was a lot of information exchanged. Probably more important than that is that I've talked at length to a lot of people who did really know him well and were friends with him. People who were in bands with him, people who recorded with him, people who hung out and spent a lot of time with him, family members, a lot of people who have a lot of valuable, priceless insights of their own that I was able to absorb and kind of osmose. I'm pretty sure I've seen every single live video there is. I'm pretty sure I've heard every single live audio recording that there is of the various live shows, all the albums. I think I've read, I don't know if I've read every single interview, but an awful lot of them. I've just been absorbing information about GG for a very, very, very long time. And I've noticed over this time that there are a lot of consistencies in his actions and in his words. A lot of consistencies. So what I'm going to do here tonight is try to string everything together and connect the dots and try to make sense of who GG was and why he did what he did and what motivated him. And, I might as well be honest and point blank and say I'm not going to succeed. I'm definitely not going to succeed. The reason for that is that there's only one person on the entire face of planet Earth who did know the whole story, and he died on June 27th, 1993. Everybody else is simply guessing. So I'm going to give you some hopefully educated guesswork here. And also maybe I can help open the floor to some meaningful discussion from people who maybe do have psychiatric training, maybe people who do or did know him really well and can add to the dialogue and can hopefully flesh out the picture of who GG Allin really was rather than the hype and the rhetoric and the self-promotion. And I might as well give you guys the trigger warning right now. There's going to be a lot of really unpleasant topics covered over the next hour. A lot of stuff that made me really uncomfortable reading about and learning about and hearing about. So, like I said earlier, fasten your seatbelt, put on your safety helmet, maybe get a barf bag if you've got a queasy stomach, or maybe just duck out right now because GG Allin did not get to where he was and did not become who he was because his story was pretty. So the big question in my mind is why? Why? Why did GG Allin end up being the self-destructivist, outlaw, scumfuck, pervert, most degenerate man in rock and roll, etc., 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 etc.? Why did he end up like that? Rather than being the beautiful, rich, adored rock star lead singer of a band that he so desperately wanted to be. I mean, he loved bands like Grand Funk. He loved Aerosmith. He really wanted to be like them. Obviously, that never happened. So if that didn't happen, then why didn't he end up being a punk rock icon like his other heroes, Iggy Pop, Stiv Bators, all the people in the Dead Boys, the Ramones? Why didn't he end up being a punk rock icon? If he couldn't be beautiful and dressed in satin, why not be a good-looking punk rock frontman? Barring that, let's say he couldn't pull that off, why didn't he end up as one of New Hampshire's best drummers in one of the area's best bands? They were called Malpractice. And if you listen to the 145 RPM single they put out, you'll hear that GG was a shiz hot drummer, man. He was an excellent drummer. And a lot of people who knew him described him as being a gifted drummer. And I believe it. So, okay, he couldn't be a rock star lead singer or a punk rock lead singer and, get his fame and adulation that way. Why not just end up being a kick-ass drummer in a kick-ass band? And let's just say that couldn't happen. Let's just say that he couldn't pull that off. Let's say that didn't happen. Why didn't he end up just being a regular guy living in Littleton, New Hampshire? Living a life, working a job, happily married to his high school sweetheart, who he did marry very early on, and who, almost until the day he died, people who knew him said that his high school sweetheart was the love of his life. How come he couldn't just be a regular guy married to the love of his life? Barring that, barring all that, why didn't GG Allin end up being just a regular old swinging single dude living in Manchester, New Hampshire? Going to every concert he possibly could, posing for pictures with his favorite rock stars, getting their autographs, taking pictures at the concerts, which he did. He did a lot of that. If you look him up, you'll see plenty of pictures of him posing with everybody from Joe Perry to Wendy O. Williams and everybody in between. And he collected records. He had the best record collection in town, probably. Why didn't that happen? Why didn't that happen? Why did he end up the way he did? Well, I'm going to attempt to explain that in spite of my lack of professional qualification, but what I can do is present to you guys some important biographical details along with a whole list of behaviors that I found he was very consistent with in his entire life. And I'm going to try hard not to speculate or fill in blanks. It's kind of difficult to, but I'm going to really, really try hard to avoid that. My hope is that with this thing, if I put out enough hard information, maybe somebody who does have psychological training or does know the field can connect the dots in an even more intricate and detailed fashion. And in order to prime that pump at the very end of my thing, I'm going to throw in some of the diagnoses that GG did receive while he was being evaluated in prison. So we're going to get down to all the reasons why GG didn't end up being what he so desperately wanted to be, whether it be a 70s style rock star, a punk rock star, an awesome drummer in a great band, a happily married dude, or just a regular fun guy going to as many concerts as he possibly could. We're going to try to figure that out. Now, a lot of the problem is that GG himself was an expert at self-promotion and self-mythology. Excuse me, he spun miles and miles and yards and yards and yards of self-promoting rhetoric. And it's that mythology and that rhetoric that most people know about GG and what most people base their opinions of GG on. And as you can guess, and as is practically always the case, the story goes a lot, and I do mean a lot, deeper than the rhetoric and the self-promotion and the mythology. As you can probably guess, everything started in childhood. What about GG, or as he was born, as he became Kevin Michael Allin, what about him? He was a high school graduate. When he was in high school, he belonged to the drama club. He was a member of the marching band. He was in, I believe, a peer counseling group of some type. He played in high school rock bands. He had a job at a restaurant. People who knew him back then described him as being a quiet kid who just loved music. He had buddies that he hung out with and had adventures with. He married his high school sweetheart, who, as I'll mention again, was described as the one true love of his life. He was devoted to music. He loved rock and roll. He loved country music. He had a life. He did things. Well, to get right back to the very beginning, he was born in 1956, and his birth name was Jesus Christ Allin. That is the actual name on his birth certificate, Jesus Christ Allin. His mother was young. She had escaped a very bad home life. Her mother, Gigi's grandmother, was a religious zealot and apparently not a nice person and not very pleasant to be around. So Gigi's mother escaped that situation by eloping with a guy named Merle Colby Allin Sr. And every single account states that Merle Colby Allin Sr. was a psycho. He was a monster. He was really screwed up. Really screwed up. Apparently, he had some kind of religious vision about his second-born child and insisted that the child be named Jesus Christ. So right off the bat, this kid's not getting off to a very good start. Dad's a psycho, and he's born Jesus Christ. The father was violent. He was violent towards the kids. He was violent towards the mother. He raped Gigi's mother while the kids were in the house. He talked about killing the whole family and then committing suicide. Gigi has told the story a number of times about how his father actually dug the graves in the basement and announced to the whole family, or at least to his mother, that he wanted to kill everybody, bury them in the basement, and join them afterwards. And according to one person I've spoken to who knew both Gigi and his brother Merle, the father actually did try to kill the entire family in some harebrained scheme, luckily, but didn't succeed. So this is not a good situation. Not a good situation at all. Violence, he had guns, he held the family at gunpoint, murder, suicide. Not only that, he kept the entire family in pretty much complete isolation. The family lived in New Hampshire in the woods, in a cabin, a log cabin. By all descriptions, no phone, no running water, no electricity, and not nearly enough heat in the wintertime. Gigi himself described it as claustrophobic. No neighbors, apparently, and also apparently no friends. People were not allowed in the house. Visitors were highly discouraged. In fact, according to Gigi, if anybody did show up at the house for some strange reason, the father would force the family to go and hide somewhere while he dealt with the interlopers. Gigi and his brother were not allowed to have toys. They weren't allowed to have books, games, puzzles, or anything that would be fun for them or that would cause them pleasure. The father forbade it violently. And if the mother somehow managed to get something like that into the cabin and the father found it, he would either burn it in front of the kids or bury it in the backyard. And you can be sure that there were violent consequences to accompany these actions. We're talking about innocent little kids here. According to Gigi's own autobiography, he was sickly. He had bad asthma. He also had trouble controlling his bladder. In other words, he wet his pants all the time. He had poor eyesight. Judging by his own accounts of his school days, it seems pretty likely that he had a learning disability of some sort. He was held back in school. He was put in special ed classes. But of course, anybody who ever knew him and his own psychological evaluation said he was of at least average intelligence. and other people have described him as being super smart. Yet he was held back in school, special ed classes. Nothing really went right for him academically. I have a feeling also, and this is where some speculation comes in, I suspect that he probably smelled bad. We'll address that a little bit later. So in the middle of all this, the claustrophobic existence in the cabin, the violent psychotic father, the asthma, the bladder problems, the probable learning disabilities, in all the middle of all this mayhem, the mother is trying to raise her children, but it apparently was not going to happen. So she tried to escape. And it apparently took her several attempts, but she finally did make her escape with the kids out of that cabin when Gigi was 5. And after that, Gigi and his brother constantly moved around, one school to another, one town to another. They were never in any one home very long or one school very long. His mother dated a lot of different guys, and according to Gigi, all of them were violent. They all liked guns, and it was never a very pretty situation. In the middle of all this, once the family finally got out, Merle Colby Allin Sr. made it his mission to track the family down, to find them and take them back. And apparently there were several kidnaps at gunpoint. He definitely succeeded in kidnapping Gigi at one point and sexually assaulted him. Now, no one's ever actually come out and said exactly what happened, but there's pretty much no denying that it did happen. It happened in the early 60s sometime. And on top of sexual assault being as horrible and traumatizing as it is, you got to remember this happened in the 1960s, the early 60s. The therapies and the treatments that we have now for the victims of childhood sexual abuse just didn't exist back then. The treatments that we have now, Gigi didn't have. So it's a pretty safe bet that the trauma he felt was never treated, and he of course had to carry this around with him for the entire rest of his life. Now, as to what actually did happen, Gigi's own words provide a few clues. He said on numerous occasions that everybody needs to be raped. He said that by experiencing tragedy and pain, you come out on the other side as a stronger person. He also said in one of his lyrics, he states that he, Gigi, quote, was reborn on the day that he fucked the devil, unquote. And I believe that's when GG Allin, emerged as a separate personality from Kevin Michael Allin, which is the name that his mother gave him when she finally escaped the father and went to enroll Gigi, Jesus Christ, in public school. She changed his name legally from Jesus Christ Allin to Kevin Michael Allin. And I'm pretty sure that he ended up with dissociative disorders in order to cope with that. He had to disassociate from what happened. It was the only way that his child's young mind could cope with what his father had done to him. And that's a very big point. Those who were close to Kevin Michael GG Allin are practically unanimous in saying that he had two distinct personalities. His own mother said that she hated Gigi, but she loved Kevin. Now, Kevin was the quiet, funny, considerate, friendly guy who lived for music. He loved to get the autographs. He loved to pose for pictures with his favorite rock stars. He had a huge record collection that he was very proud of and very knowledgeable about. He enjoyed hanging out with the gang. He loved having some laughs. He loved going out on adventures. He was, by all accounts, a really nice, funny guy who was just fun to hang out with. GG, on the other hand, was a bit of a different story. GG, as we all know, was a complete asshole. He didn't care about anybody. He was greedy. He was selfish. He was a thief. He was what all the rhetoric would have you believe. He was no fun. He had no friends. He was nothing but pain and anger and revenge. He was an incorrigible sociopath. He was a narcissist. He had no emotions. That was GG. I believe that Kevin is where the innocent child resided, and I believe that GG is where all of the emotional damage and hurt and trauma resided. I think it's very interesting that the two personalities were divided by the origins of their respective names. GG, the sociopathic narcissist asshole, GG was the name that came from the name his father gave him. His father is the one who named him Jesus Christ. And the name GG came from his older brother being very young and saying GG instead of Jesus. So GG, the scumbag, GG got his name from the name that his father gave him. Kevin, the nice guy, Kevin came from the name that his mother gave him. The mother who he loved up until the day he died. The mother who he was going to go visit after the infamous concert at the gas station, his last ever show. He was going to go visit his mom after that show. So GG from the father, Kevin from the mother. GG was a product of the father, Kevin was a product of the mother. And I'll say it again, GG stayed close to his mother for the rest of his entire life and had zero contact, from what I understand, zero or at least very little contact with the father until the day he died. And by his own account, he struggled with those two personalities early in his life until he made a conscious decision to embrace the GG side. The name of his first album kind of says it right off the bat. Always was, is, and always shall be. That is a reference to GG. And if you read the liner notes on the back of the album is dedicated to, and I quote, the late Kevin Allin. GG and Kevin. He embraced the GG side of his personality and said, Kevin, sayonara. And I'm pretty sure, the way I understand it, the way it makes sense to me and the way I can put it together, is that GG, even though GG was born from pure victimization, GG was the strong one who was in control. Kevin was the one who couldn't hold a marriage together. Kevin couldn't cut it as a rock star. Kevin worked as a custodian in a nursing home. So Kevin had to go. GG had to take over. GG was the one who was fearless. GG was the one who had the drive. GG was the one who had the ambition. GG was the one who would sit there at a desk and write letters for hours and hours and hours, nonstop. No matter how bad condition he was in later, he never relented in promoting himself. Kevin probably couldn't do that, or wouldn't do that, or maybe didn't want to do that. Apparently, GG really became ascendant after his marriage fell apart. There are people who knew him back then and said that he unraveled, to use the exact term, that GG unraveled after the marriage fell apart. So it seems like his marriage falling apart and the sexual assault were the two major events. Of course, there's another key event, and that was when GG's brother dosed him with LSD, which was probably sometime during high school. Now, according to friends, and this is a story that's related in the movie Hated, according to some of his high school friends, Kevin had been a completely straight arrow, totally sober guy who didn't do drugs until his brother dosed him. And according to their account, Kevin reacted by taking all of his clothes off, getting extremely pissed off, trying to kill his brother, quote, tearing the place apart, unquote, acting like GG Allin later acted. So it seems like before he had his mind torn to bits by LSD, GG was latent, and afterwards GG was blatant. And of course, being dosed by LSD was another case, yet another case of Kevin Allin without his knowledge and against his will, and being powerless to present, was made a victim. He was victimized with an explosive, mind-altering, life-changing event forced on him that he had no control over. He didn't understand what was happening. He was helpless, again. And I think it's really worth pointing out that GG never talked about that experience that I know of. In his own autobiography, he mentions it in passing, very briefly. But I have a feeling that it was a far, far bigger event in his life than he ever let on. And I really think that's when the struggle between the two personalities began. But it's worth mentioning, too, that Kevin never died. Kevin could still emerge on occasion, even until the very last day of his life. There's the infamous video of GG leading the parade through New York City after his last ever show at the gas station. And I might have heard this wrong, and I didn't have time to go back and watch it again, but if I remember correctly, GG runs into a very normal looking couple on the streets of New York, and they say, "Hey Kevin, what's up?" And they have a little bit of a chit chat, and he goes on his merry way. I was like, wow, even that late in the game, there were people who still knew him as Kevin, who didn't know him before as anybody other than GG. Apparently Kevin was still there. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's what I saw and heard in that video of the last day of his life. So, what do you got? You got all that. You've got a whole childhood of physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, no stable home life, a very difficult school life, all of the above. I think because of that, GG never learned how to make friends, like really make friends, and more importantly, how to keep friends. And needless to say, he never learned how to maintain a healthy, successful, long-term relationship. He didn't have any examples on how to do it. No one taught him how to do it. His own mother said that she was working 3 part-time jobs just to support the kids, just to keep the family alive. So she was never around. And the guys she was dating at the time were certainly no prizes. So who's going to teach this kid how to live his life? He was basically just left to fend for himself and figure things out. And I'll tell you, any child with a so-called normal upbringing ain't going to be able to do that, let alone someone with GG's upbringing. A child is not going to just find their own way without some kind of guidance. So, one of the things that GG did throughout his entire life was turn weaknesses into strengths. I'll go back to the lyric I quoted a second ago. According to his lyric, he was the one who fucked the devil, not the other way around. Relating to that, he turned all of his hurt and pain into strength. He was like, well, all you people out there who hurt me, my father, my ex-wife, society, my school principal, you all hurt me? Well, check this out. I can hurt myself far better than you could ever hurt me. You think you can hurt me? Watch this. Watch this. Watch this. You think you can hurt me? I'll do better. GG was certainly a cutter. He cut himself up to ribbons on stage. Maybe off, I don't know. But I've talked to a few cutters in my day, and they have told me, and you can probably read about this yourself, that when they cut themselves, they release their pain. They release their pain. And Gigi stated in one of his prison psychiatric interviews, and I quote you exactly, he said, "People suffer a lot in the world. And this way I do it to myself. And when I leave the stage, I don't have to suffer anymore." He also said in an interview that the time that he felt the best in his life, the only time he ever felt fully alive and completely in touch with his inner self, was when he was on stage beating himself up and watching his own blood flow. He said that was the best high he could ever have. Relating to that, he described his performances, and this is also in writing, in his direct words, from a psychiatric report, or actually not a psychiatric report, but in a piece he wrote. He wrote that his performances were a crucial, stabilizing therapeutic element in his emotional life, unquote. He also remarked on a number of occasions to a whole bunch of different people that he did not like the people who came to see him just because of the damage that he did to himself. He did not like the people who came just for the antics and the blood. He didn't like those people. And I'm pretty sure that explains at least one way in which, to use his words, the audience was his enemy. Because they were there for all the wrong reasons. They were there to watch him undergo this violent, painful self-therapy and take it as entertainment rather than the music. That's why the audience was his enemy. I think there are other reasons why the audience was his enemy, but we'll get into those in a minute or two. Other ways he took weaknesses and turned them into strength. I am told by somebody who knew him well that when he was a child, the psychotic father forced him to wear a dress. Whether that was because of the weak bladder or other sick reasons, I don't know. But there is at least one photo out there of Gigi as a child wearing a dress. Now, of course, that would traumatize anybody. That would be seen as a weakness. So later on in school, he made a point of wearing women's clothes. Besides the fact that, and he actually told me this himself, he said that the best looking clothes were in the women's department. So he shopped in the women's department. But I also believe that it was probably a big, oh yeah, you're going to make me wear a dress? Fine, I'll wear nothing but women's clothes. F you. And, there's a whole lot of, as you know, a lot of F you in his presentation. So we're seeing where some of that F you is directed. He was very honest about being attracted to both men and women sexually. Of course, you can imagine how well that went over in early 1960s New Hampshire and Vermont. Not too well. So later on in his life, he made the "I'll fuck anything" a badge of honor. He bragged about how he had sex with men and women and animals and whatever. Y'all didn't like me for doing that when I was a kid? Well, I'll do it as much as I want to now. F you. When he was in prison, he attended AA meetings. Now, anybody who knows AA, knows the program, knows that a crucial tenet of Alcoholics Anonymous is to surrender yourself to a higher power. What's one of the most popular songs he wrote when he got out of jail? I am the highest power. I am the highest power. He's not a prisoner admitting that he had no control over his alcohol addiction. He was the highest power. He will never again submit to any kind of authority, whether it be the higher power or the principal at school or the psychotic father or the law or whatever. It's another image building exercise. It's another act of weakness that he turned into a position of strength. And I'll just throw in a little sidebar. Gigi loved traditional country music. He loved that old-timey country music, and the Louvin Brothers were one of his favorite bands. They have a song called there's a higher power. As we all know, talent borrows, genius steals. Anyway, I believe that that highest power thing would also be a way of dealing with the sense of helplessness and worthlessness that any survivor of childhood sexual abuse is going to feel. Not to mention this feeling of being completely powerless as a prisoner. You know, when you're a prisoner, you're subject to the whims of the man 24/7. So he took all of that feeling of weakness and powerlessness and turned it into a strength, into being the highest power, into God. How often did GG Allin say, I am God? GG Allin is God. He went from being completely powerless, victim of abuse, to God. But that was only after every single attempt to be powerful otherwise, using the power of rock and roll, failed. Did not pan out. I'm going to throw a good one at you here. A lot of you people might not believe it, but conflict avoidance was one of Gigi's big personality traits. He did not like confrontation. Why do I say that? I'll tell you why. First of all, you can be sure that any confrontation that he had as a child was going to go very badly. Any confrontation with his father, not going to go good. Any confrontation with school bullies who he derided to me in person, he hated the kids he went to school with. Here's this sickly asthmatic kid dressed in women's clothes, and any confrontation with those jerks he went to school with, that ain't gonna end well. Nope. Any confrontation with the law, it's gonna end badly. I really believe that Gigi's way of handling unpleasant situations with pretty much anybody was to go ahead and do what he wanted to do, knowing that the people he was dealing with weren't going to like it without consulting them. And then afterwards, presenting his deeds as a done deal, like it or leave it, love it or lump it. You don't like it? F you. And there's quite a few examples of that. The very first GG Allin record, we talked about a second ago, the Always Was, Is, and Always Shall Be album. We all know that record. It's credited to GG Allin. Originally, it was supposed to be credited to the Jabbers, or at least GG Allin and the Jabbers. That's what the full band credit was going to be. The original front cover was going to have a picture of the entire band. There were also 3 songs on the original album that were not sung by Gigi. That was the original idea for the album. Of course, we all know the album is credited to GG Allin. It's got just a picture of him on the front, and he sings all the songs. He made all of those changes without consulting the other guys in the band. He unilaterally changed the name, changed the cover, removed those 3 songs, had the record made, and when it was done, said, well, here it is. Here's the album. You don't like it? F you. I think it was a lot easier for him to give the big old F you than to risk rejection or being turned down by asking permission. You know the old saying, to seek permission is to seek denial? He couldn't handle seeking denial like that. I personally had an experience with his conflict avoidance. In 1989, I booked Gigi to play a solo acoustic show in Danbury, Connecticut, where I lived at the time. And we talked about it a lot. That morphed into me putting together a band to back him up and record a record with. And that's where things were left up until the moment he showed up at my doorstep with a band in tow already. He didn't tell me he was going to show up with a band. He simply did. He did not risk rejection. He did not risk denial. He simply showed up with a bunch of other guys, and if I didn't like it, well, F me. A lot easier to deal with the F me than to risk denial or rejection. And the band that he showed up with on my doorstep in 1989 was called the Disappointments from Muskegon, Michigan. An excellent band, really good band. But guess what? He pulled the same thing with them as well. When he got out of jail in 1991, he got back together with the Disappointments, and the Disappointments were ready to pick up where they left off before GG went to jail in 1989. They put together a set, they had shows, and GG, I guess, just wasn't feeling it, so he split. He simply abandoned them. Never told them, never asked them, never consulted with them, nothing. Just took off. I really believe he couldn't handle the idea of confronting them with that. So he just left. And if they didn't like it, F you. Easier, right? GG talked on a couple of occasions, always obliquely, about how his girlfriend, after he was married, had an abortion. And the way that he describes it, even as very brief and in a cursory fashion as he talks about it, it seems to me pretty clear that he was traumatized by it. It's his choice of words in describing the event. It really bugged him. It knocked him for a loop. So, and this might be filling in some blanks and speculating a lot, but it appears to me that after that happened, his sex life was based around anything but actually having sex. It was based on, all the things we know about GG, the knife play, the cutting, the bondage, the body fluids, all of that. Anything other than regular sex, which would result in a girl getting pregnant, as did happen after the abortion, and GG being faced with yet another really unpleasant situation in his life that he just did not want to deal with. So no more regular sex. That have probably coupled with other facets of his personality, but I'm going to leave that for people who might know more about it to speculate on a lot further. Now, GG always prided himself on being very sneaky and very crafty. And I believe that's because in his childhood he had to be sneaky and he had to be crafty in order to keep anything that he wanted, any personal possessions, without being punished by his father. He had to sneak around. He couldn't confide in anybody. He couldn't aggressive way of doing things. Direct confrontation had bad consequences. And that also goes to school and law enforcement and all that. So he learned very early on to avoid conflict and to do things beforehand and F you if you don't like it. Because there is no other way. He could not win conflicts prior to that. This also might be hard for some people to believe, but GG Allin really did not like to function outside of his comfort zone. Anytime that he found himself outside of his comfort zone, and very specifically in a performance type situation, he would find a way not to do it, and usually in a violent fashion. And there's a whole number of examples. One was his well-told story of the time that he tackled Thalia Zedek, who was the lead singer of this band Come. He always said that she pissed him off, so he tackled her. Well, according to the story told by Len Colby, who was GG's friend and roadie and merch guy and videographer for a very long time, Len was there and he said that what it was that GG was at this club, the band Come were playing, and they knew he was there, so they invited him to come up on stage, and apparently kept inviting him to come up on stage. And For one reason or another, he just didn't want to. So rather than say, no, no, I'm not feeling it tonight, or well, no, I don't know the song you guys are doing, and I don't know, I'd just rather sit here and drink. I don't know. He bum rushed the stage and tackled Thalia, the lead singer, and it ended up being a big wrestling match, and he got thrown out. He was outside of his comfort zone. How about the first time he was supposed to be on national TV for the Morton Downey show? Nationwide TV exposure for GG Allin in 1988. Something he had dreamed of his entire life. Nationwide TV. So what does he do? He gets completely drunk and messed up with a bunch of his friends, completely destroys 2 hotel rooms that the producers of the show put him up in, got thrown out, and couldn't do the Morton Downey Jr. show. I really believe it's because he was not comfortable going on nationwide TV. So he acted in a way that guaranteed that he wouldn't. How about the 2 poetry readings he did? There's the infamous 1989 poetry reading at the Primal Plunge in Boston, which ends very violently. He doesn't read any poetry. At the very, very end of it, after the violent explosion, when nobody throws him out, he kind of has no choice, so he starts to read poetry into this amplifier that's feeding back and screeching and making horrible noises. Then they cut the power and throw him out. He most likely was not comfortable at all standing up in front of a bunch of people and just reading poetry. So he turned it into a violent and at the same time therapeutic situation to where he didn't have to read poetry. He did the exact same thing at New York University in 1991, as is well documented in the Hated documentary. He made darn sure that he wasn't going to read any poetry. He assaults the audience beforehand, throws a chair at them. He's going to go after them with spray paint and whatever. Cops come in, no poetry reading. He was going to do a guest spot with the almighty Anti-Scene in 1993, about a week before he died. It was all set up. Anti-Scene was playing at the Milestone Club in Charlotte. Gigi was waiting outside in the van by the backstage door. And for Anti-Scene's encore, they were going to invite him in and surprise everybody by having him sing an encore with Anti-Scene. What happened? He got into some kind of violent argument with his girlfriend and split. Once again, I really believe that was a situation he wasn't comfortable with. It wasn't a situation that he was in total control of. So he just said, F you. I'm out of here. You don't like it? F you. Same thing happened when he was recording the Carnival of Excess album. His basically acoustic band album, which is a fantastic album. Yes, I released it on vinyl, but I always love that album anyway. It's just not really a plug. There were a couple of occasions, and these are stories told by Mark Robinson, the guy who produced the album and originally released it, on a couple of occasions when Gigi absolutely flipped out, lost his gourd, and was getting ready to bail on the whole project over really like very, very small, almost irrelevant reasons. And Mark had to like really use all of his skills to talk him off the ledge and get him back in the project. I'll say it again. I believe that Gigi was outside of his comfort zone. It was just him in a studio with some real top shelf acoustic musicians having to bear himself lyrically, which he did finally do, and he just wasn't comfortable with it. So he was looking for any excuse to have a big explosion and a big blow up and bail. And if you don't like it, F you. And going back to the acoustic show that he was supposed to play in Danbury, he told me afterwards that what he was going to do was show up with an acoustic guitar, but just smash the guitar over somebody's head and split. anything rather than sit down in front of a room full of people with nothing but an acoustic guitar. And if you don't like it, F you. The guy was consistent, if nothing else. Now, GG was 100% consistent from very early in his career to the very end of his career, that he only got into bands, only got into music as a means of revenge. He was all about the revenge. And that seems kind of weird if you consider that the early bands he was in, such as Malpractice, were very commercial sounding and very glamorous looking. I mean, Grand Funk 1974 was cited as an influence on how Malpractice looked, with the satin and the bell bottoms and, just looking really good. And the music that Malpractice played was, maybe I shouldn't say commercial, but it was just really good 70s rock. You know, there was nothing raw about it or unacceptable about it. The lyrics were, like on the single, there's a lyric about the Devil's Triangle and a lyric about a girl. You know, I mean, standard 70s rock music stuff. But if you consider that being in a band like that and being good looking and being able to wear those flashy clothes and being rich and famous were revenge, then that makes a lot of sense. That being a glamorous rock star was revenge. He spoke a lot of times about some school official who called him, quote, a penny waiting for change, unquote. He also spoke about one of his friend's fathers calling him, quote, nothing but a piece of driftwood, unquote. These people thought he was worthless. They thought he was no good. So he would have his revenge by being beautiful, by being in a rock band, all eyes on him, spotlight on him. He was going to get his revenge on them. Not to mention getting revenge on all the jerks at school who laughed at him and picked on him for wearing women's clothes and wetting his pants and just being a weirdo in general. So you add to all of that about his frequent recollections of having always felt like an outsider and never fitting in and being an alien, in his own words. I mean, being a rock star is like being the ultimate outsider. You're all alone. You're in the spotlight. Nobody else around you except, you know, a guy over there and a guy over there and someone behind you. All eyes on the loner in the spotlight from a position of strength, not a position of weakness. And I'll stress again that from the very beginning, GG wanted to be a rock star. He wanted the fame and the fortune and the trappings that went with being a rock star. You look at Malpractice, for example, that band had managers. They sent out press kits. They had promo photos. They had a van. They played gigs. They had all the trimmings of a regular rock band who was on the move and trying to make it. And there are lots and lots of pictures of him. I don't know if we can actually see one of them, but there's pictures of him. This one, for example, in Malpractice, all dressed in the denim and the satin and the scarves and posing, being a rock star, being beautiful, getting his revenge. He, or Malpractice, sent demo cassettes and records to anybody who he thought would listen or write about him, or for that matter, anybody who would sign him. And he did court the major labels. There's at least one rejection letter that I've seen, and it's out there somewhere. Epic Records, which is a subsidiary of CBS, which is about as major as you can get, Epic sent him a rejection letter. So he was trying. He was trying to get signed. He courted famous producers. You know, Ganya Raven, who actually did produce him. David Peel, who actually did produce him. Kim Fowley, who declined to produce him early on, but then supposedly was going to produce his last album. Those are all names. He always made a really big deal about playing with famous people. He always name-checked his association with Cheetah Chrome and Wayne Kramer and Dennis Thompson and West Beach. All these people. He took pictures with them. Even when he was in prison, he had photos taken with West Beach of the Plasmatics and a band that they were supposedly going to form. He wanted rock stardom, but it never happened. He never got to be a rock star. The big recording contract eluded him. Couldn't get his revenge that way. So what better to get revenge on the very same people who wouldn't sign him and wouldn't manage him than to declare war on them? As we all know, he ranted and raved and raged and railed long and hard about the music business. He hated MTV. He hated the major labels. He hated all the phony rock stars. He hated them all. But in 1984, he made an MTV video. It was called Live Fast, Die Fast. It's out there. You can see it. It's him, even though he's into his scumfuck rock and roll phase. It's him in an attempt to look glamorous and to play very commercial, mainstream hard rock music. And they made an MTV video for it. Unfortunately, MTV never played it. So he declared war on MTV. And he declared war on the major labels. Of course, I mentioned the rejection letters that he probably collected, one of which we know of for sure is out there. And of course, all the big phony corporate rock stars, Guns N' Roses, Sonic Youth, and others being targets of his. What can you say? They made it. He didn't. So he declared war on them. And I believe that's also why his audience became his enemy. His desire for revenge is why his audience became his enemy. Why was his audience his enemy? Well, first, they didn't make him a beautiful rock star. He never played to huge audiences of adoring people. Every performer who ever lived has probably had revenge fantasies or wanted to lash out when they played a very tiny little audience. You get disappointed, you get hurt, you want more people to be there, but no one lashes out at the 4 people who show up at your gig. I never did. But GG actually crossed the line. He did lash out on them. He would physically assault them. He would verbally assault them. He would act out all that frustration on his audience because they didn't live up to his expectations. They didn't help him be a beautiful rock star, or even to be a punk rock star, or a great drummer in a kick-ass 1970s rock band. The audience did not live up to his expectations. They did not make him what he wanted to be. So they were the enemy. And we should mention, too, that he acted out his frustrations on himself as well, with the convulsions and the cutting and the hitting himself. He was turning a lot of that frustration inward, because you figure at some point maybe he had to be to blame as well. Not good enough, powerless, hopeless, frightened. Kevin had to go. Remember that. Now the irony, and this is ironic to the max, is that when GG started to act out like that and punish his crowd for letting him down, that's when people started to notice, and that's what started drawing the crowds. He hated these people. He's lashing out at them for not making him what he wanted to be. Now they're coming to see him because he's attacking people and attacking himself and knocking things over and destroying things. Now they're coming out to see him. So it becomes a vicious circle. The more outrageous he got, the more the people came to see the spectacle. The bigger the audiences got, the more GG got pissed off because they were coming to see the spectacle and not for the music and not to make him a rock star. So he acted out more and punished them more and punished himself more and so on, and so on, and so on. And you definitely hear echoes of that in some of his performances, like the Primal Plunge poetry reading, when he's really losing his shiz at this audience and he's just yelling at them, he's screaming at them, where were you? Where were you? Where were you at this club and that club back in 1980, whatever? Where were you? As in, where were you when I needed you to make me a rock star? Where were you when I was playing empty clubs? Where were you when I was trying to hustle my records at record stores and nobody wanted to buy them? Where were you when I wanted to live my dream? F you. Bam, bam, bam. Revenge. His audience let him down. They weren't there for him. So it's time for revenge. He said that at the very gig I promoted in 1989 at SUNY Purchase. He said, you want to see a spectacle, right? Well, maybe you won't see nothing. As in, you didn't want to see me then for the right reasons, and now you want to see me for the wrong reasons. F you. According to a guy I know who knew GG very well, he told me point blank that GG told him that it pissed him off when people would encourage him to hurt himself for their entertainment. That's what he said. They were coming to see him too late and for all the wrong reasons. Let's not forget also that around this time, we're talking about early to mid 80s, hardcore punk was really becoming a thing. You know, there was always punk rock, but then hardcore became a genre of its own. And, you know, by nature, hardcore performers, especially lead singers, were more outrageous than punkers, more confrontational than regular punk rockers, and, you know, sometimes bloody, sometimes really getting into it with the crowd. And just by, you know, the nature of his performance, GG found himself associated with hardcore. Probably against his will, really, because GG was not a hardcore guy. He wasn't hardcore. He was a rock and roller at heart. You know, 1980s rock and roll. That's where GG came from, and traditional punk rock. He did not come from hardcore. But he kind of found himself lumped in with those people, and in order to stay competitive with the hardcore frontmen, he had to up the ante and be more hardcore than they were. One more element for that vicious circle, where people are coming to see him for the wrong reason, and he has to just keep amping it up and amping up and amping it up. On top of all that, as if that wasn't enough, somewhere along the line, probably after the breakup of the Jabbers, he started to channel his horrific childhood into his onstage performance. And that was the aforementioned therapeutic element to his stage show. He's releasing all of this pain through the violence against himself, when his violence was primarily directed at himself. He was doing that to make himself feel better, to heal himself. But as far as the audience could see, that was just more outrageousness. And more people came to see him for that, all for the wrong reasons. More anger, more revenge, more of his audience as his enemy. And I'll tell you, it took me forever to understand, or at least get an idea of why he always considered his audience to be his enemy. I think that might explain it. So why would he feel so strongly about that? About not being able to be a beautiful rock star, and to why he had to punish his audiences for not getting him there? I'm pretty sure, I believe that GG Allin, much like Kurt Cobain, really believed in the power of rock and roll. He believed that rock and roll would redeem him. He believed that fame and fortune would save him from who he was and from his circumstances. You got to remember, he was always name-checking people who were more famous than him. He auditioned for Richie Stotts of the Plasmatics. He auditioned and played some gigs with Cheetah Chrome, the Dead Boys. Apparently, he also auditioned for Joe Perry of Aerosmith when Joe Perry broke off from Aerosmith. He bragged about West Beach from the Plasmatics wanting to start a band with him. He made the absolute most of his associations with members of the MC5 and Genya Raven and David Peel and Kim Fowley. I really believe that he believed in the sincerity and the power of his favorite rockers. He always tried to get close to them. He collected their autographs. He posed for pictures with them every chance he could. He saved them. He had them published in a zine. I mean, he really meant it. He really believed in the power of rock and roll. And I think one example that kind of underlines that is when Iggy Pop, who was one of his heroes, quote, sold out. And I'm going to guess that's when the Blah 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 album came out. Because Blah 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 was a very commercial record, a very mainstream sounding record, and that was in 1986. Okay, so you can line that up with events in Gigi's life. When Iggy sold out by doing Blah Blah Blah, Gigi felt betrayed. He himself said, quote, even Iggy let me down, unquote. And so his heroes let him down, and so that's when Gigi took it upon himself to be the rock and roll messiah. No one else was going to put danger into rock and roll. Iggy sold out. Stiv was either dead or going to be dead soon. The Dead Boys had broken up. You know, all of that. No one else was going to put that danger, that punk rock danger that Iggy and Stiv Bader specialized in. No one was going to do it. So now it's up to Gigi. And it's sometime around then, like around 86, when Blah 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 came out, that Gigi sold off his entire collection of autographs and rock and roll memorabilia. He dumped it all. Somewhere, I don't know if I have a copy of it, but I saw an actual price list that he was circulating with all of the autographs he had that he collected in person. And they all said, to Gigi from Joe Perry, to Gigi from Wendy Williams. He sold it all, got rid of it all. At some point, I'm pretty sure he got rid of his entire record collection, or at least most of it. And to this day, those photos are out there. You can find them. They're readily available on the internet. You can see them. He posed for pictures with his favorite rock stars. He believed in the power of rock and roll. And of course, since his favorite rockers let him down, later on in life, he turned that, I'll say weakness, for lack of a better term, into a strength by denying that he ever liked anyone at all, and that he had no heroes. He didn't listen to music. He didn't like any of that. He didn't, none of that. The one exception that I know of being Tiny Tim. He always professed his love for Tiny Tim. And people who really knew him said that he really did legitimately love Tiny Tim. Pretty cool, I think. As the aforementioned Mark Robinson from Punk Media and I have had conversations about, there were a lot of similarities between GG Allin and Tiny Tim. But that's a different subject for a different day. So yeah, we've talked about the disassociation of the two different personalities between Kevin and Gigi. Kevin was the quiet, funny, considerate guy who lived for music and get the autographs and pose for pictures and had the record collection and hanging out with the gang and having a few laughs. Whereas Gigi was the different guy with all the emotional damage and the hurt and the pain and the trauma. No fun, no friends, F you all the time. Nothing but pain, anger, and revenge. And of course, that's reflected in the first album title, his decision to embrace the childhood trauma rather than cure himself of it. And that's what somebody told me point blank, that Gigi told them that he decided to embrace the trauma rather than cure himself. And all of that ties into a lot of the things that Gigi said and did during his life. For example, there were a few occasions in his life when he had to go for psychological counseling or therapy. The first time being when he was married. His wife insisted that he try to get some kind of help. Whether it was marriage counseling, I don't know, or just plain old psychological counseling for what was going on in his head, I don't know. But his wife insisted that he get therapy. GG said many times that he went, but he completely walled himself off and refused to cooperate. He said the same thing about his experiences in prison, being psychologically evaluated. He said they would try to pick him apart like a lab animal, but he walled himself off and didn't let him go near. Now, this is, of course, in spite of the evidence to the contrary, and we'll get to that later, where at least one of the prison psychologists said that he was a very cooperative and honest subject. Excuse me. My guess is that GG would let the psychiatrist, go so far, but no further. It's also worth noting that prison and marriage were the two of the times in his life when GG really came to the fore. Prison especially. Kevin was not going to make it in prison. Kevin was not going to survive in prison, but GG would. That disassociation, I think, was verbalized by GG when he talked a number of times when he was married, when he was like, he said he would sit with his head in his hands, just agonizing about who he was, Kevin or GG, Kevin or GG, Kevin or GG, who am I? He just couldn't decide who he was going to be until he ultimately decided that he was GG. And that certainly does imply that he made that conscious effort to embrace the side of his personality, which is where all the pain and the suffering, but then in a sort of twisted way of looking at it logically, where all the strength was. Now, just to make it a little more complex, there were plenty of people who knew him said he had the ability to turn GG off and on. That he could access GG when he needed to, but that when he was relaxed and comfortable, he would just be Kevin. I kind of believe that, you see, and just from what I know about split personality disorder and disassociation, that different personalities come to the fore based on the circumstances, based on the situations. That's something that someone with real training and real knowledge has to address. But that's what it seems like to me. Maybe he had the ability to turn GG off and on. Maybe it just happened naturally. I really don't know. I'm going to rely on a learned opinion on that. It's my opinion that he couldn't completely split GG away from Kevin until he left New Hampshire. Because New Hampshire was where the failed marriages were, the failed bands were, all of his old friends, his family, everybody who knew Kevin. He could not firmly establish himself as GG until he got away from that. He literally had to leave his past behind. And that's because GG could spin his history any way he wanted without somebody calling him out on it. He could spin all the mythology, build the image as much as he wanted. No one was going to say, man, that didn't happen that way. You're full of it. You know, which was a big problem when Joe Coughlin was originally going to write GG's autobiography. GG presented Joe Coughlin with a fully written autobiography. But when Joe Coughlin started interviewing people he knew back in the day in depth, he got a lot of, what are you talking about, man? It didn't happen that way. Let me tell you what really happened. He got a lot of that. And he actually, because of that, ended up abandoning the autobiography, or biography, I should say. He gave up. And that's what GG was trying to avoid more than anything else. He could not be GG Allin 24/7 in New Hampshire. He could not leave the frightened, helpless, asthmatic child in that horrible cabin. He could leave behind the embarrassed school kid who wet his pants. He could leave behind the abuse and the trauma, but he was still the consummate outsider. He was the outer spaceman that he talked about in his song Dead or Alive. This dude who had the pleasure of talking with, who knew GG in the early days, said that he tried to talk to GG in prison, but, quote, couldn't get past GG, unquote. And I'll just mention before that GG was a survivor. Kevin could not have survived prison or any of his other traumas. So Rob, my friend, who I don't think would probably mind having his name checked there. See, this is live. This is what happens. Probably couldn't get past GG in prison, because if he talked to Kevin in prison, that probably would have marked Kevin as being weak, unable to defend himself, and an easy mark. So GG was the guy who had to be in prison. So GG was able to survive prison and all the other traumas, and not only survive all of that, but to thrive on it. So imagine a persona who thrived on nothing but pain and tragedy, as he said, and you have GG Allin. But on top of all that, he could never completely get rid of Kevin. He could never do it. I've been told by a couple of people on different occasions that he actually had, I guess you would call, safe spaces where he could go and just be Kevin. He had friends he could hang out with. He had places he could hang out with and just be Kevin. Apparently his mother's house was one of them. From what I'm told, he could stay there and just be Kevin, but he would leave when, also as I was told, quote, he felt GG coming on, unquote. When GG started coming on, he had to leave the safe space and go out and be GG, which, of course, raises the issue of how much control he really did have over his personalities. I think it's interesting, too, to note that a lot of times he referred to himself in the plural. He, especially in lyrics, he referred to himself a lot as we. He referred to himself as us. At the famous gas station video afterwards, he tells the guy that, quote, they tried to arrest us, unquote, even though he's the only guy from the band there. A lot of his lyrics talk about we instead of I. I'm going to make a suggestion that he's addressing his two personalities, Kevin and GG. And I'll also mention, too, in terms of GG chronically exaggerating a lot of stuff, which we will get to in a minute, the cops never actually did try to arrest him at the gas station show. They pretty much, the cops, when they do arrive, just kind of stand around bemusedly studying the situation, but let him go free and clear without hindrance. They did not try to arrest him, but he said he did. Whew. Think about more examples of how he always painted himself as being in control. He always presented himself as being in control. In his autobiography, he talks about deliberately wetting his pants in order to be sent home from school, rather than it happening accidentally. He said a lot that he didn't think about the future, he didn't make any plans, he didn't care what tomorrow brought. My own experience and the recollections of somebody else who worked with him say that he was the exact opposite, that he was a chronic worrier, that he was constantly planning. He was always, his brain was just always turning about what to do next and where to go next. But he always said he didn't give a fuck what tomorrow brought. And that's a phrase he used over and over and over again, especially in his autobiography. I didn't give a fuck. GG didn't give a fuck. Didn't give a fuck. I kind of think maybe he was protesting too much. He really did care, and he cared a lot. He cared a lot. As mentioned before, he fucked the devil. The devil didn't fuck him. Another example is the Jabbers, his original band, did not quit because they were sick of all of GG's antics and constantly having gigs canceled and whatnot. They quit because they couldn't keep up with him, in his words. Another way in which he painted himself being in control all the time, he really always made a point of being hated. Allegedly thrived on hate. And, maybe Gigi really did thrive on hate, but maybe that was also his way of taking a negative, painful experience, as when he always felt like an outsider and was being picked on in school, and turning it into a badge of honor. You're going to hate me? Well, I am the most hated. I'm the most hated mofo out there. I am so hated, no one's more hated than me. F you. It's a badge of honor. That was another area he had no control over as a child, but then took control of it and exaggerated it and became the most hated ever. He could do that. He could succeed at that. He could totally succeed at that. He said many, many times that his upbringing had nothing to do with the way he turned out. He said that he was the way he was strictly out his decision. He said that he never blamed his parents for how he turned out, and in fact, he was grateful to them. That's a really good way of taking control over an uncontrollable and intolerable situation. He was grateful to his parents for the way he came out. He, God, the rock and roll messiah, the most hated in the world, the most outrageous scumbag of them all. Thanks, Mom. Thanks, Dad. He said quite a few times that he had no possessions, that he didn't own anything, that everything he owned was able to fit into a suitcase or even a paper bag. Now, that could be from his excessively deprived childhood, but it also wasn't true. He definitely had personal belongings that he kept in a safe spot, maybe in other safe spots. He had a bank deposit. He had a safe deposit box. He had a couple of safe deposit boxes. He had a bank account. He had stuff. But whether it's because he grew up deprived or because it was just good for his image, maybe both. Maybe both. Bit of an exaggeration. And I think that the exact same thing applies to his rape rhetoric. He used that rape word an awful lot. But how do you make yourself in control of a situation like that? How do you go from being a helpless, brutalized victim to being the one in control? Well, you constantly refer to yourself as a rapist. You write a song about it. You say everybody should be raped, etc., etc., etc. And I'm going to take a little side note here and say that in spite of all of his rhetoric to the contrary, and all of his braggadocio otherwise, I do not believe that GG Allin ever raped anybody. None of the people who really knew him believe he raped anybody. When he did his prison time in 1989, he was convicted of assault, not rape. The woman involved never accused him of rape. The prosecutor never tried him for rape. That was a word that never came up the entire time. He went to prison for assault. And in that specific circumstance, everybody involved, including the woman, agreed that it was a consensual situation that because of excessive alcohol and just general stupidity got out of control. So Gigi, the helpless victim, used rhetoric involving rape an awful lot, I believe, in order to present himself as being in control and to be the one in power in a situation like that. And it really backfired against him, because to this day, people refer to him as a rapist, even though, even in this day and age when people feel comfortable coming forward with stuff like that and feel safer doing stuff like that and calling out people who rape, no one ever has. No one ever has. It's never happened. There's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that he actually was a rapist. None. The record shows it. What can I tell you? So yeah, he tried to take control of that situation and that imagery, and didn't work very well. And of course, remember, the ultimate way of taking control was to be the highest power, to be God. GG Allin is God. Get on your knees and worship me. He did that a lot. He was no longer powerless. Mentioned before that GG Allin exaggerated an awful lot, as if his own life was not outrageous enough, as if his own actions were not over the top enough. He exaggerated all the time. The commonly cited and accepted factoid about his arrest record was that GG Allin was arrested 52 times. I don't know how they came up with that number, but 52 times. Now, as of his, and I've looked at the court records are out there. As of his conviction in 1989, he had 5 arrests on record. 2 of them were definitely related to gigs. There was one in New Haven and one in Milwaukee. One of those convictions was for the Ann Arbor incident in 1989. And 2 were for unknown causes. And there were 3 arrests after 1989, Georgia, Florida, and Texas. 8 arrests that I was able to find hard evidence of. Now, I know they had pretty bad brushes with the law elsewhere. Apparently, I really don't know. I don't know if the Morton Downey incident ended up in an arrest, but the only written documentation I could find of about Gigi being arrested were those 8 I just named. Now, you think 8 arrests would be enough, but no, Gigi had to make it into 52. And that number is entered the GG Allin lore now. GG Allin, outrageous rocker, arrested 52 times. 8 is enough, you would think. Kind of the same deal, though. If anybody has records of him being arrested more than that, Ann Arbor, New Haven, Milwaukee, Georgia, Florida, Texas, and the other 2, I believe, in New Hampshire early on, please post it. It's an area that could be clarified, a good way of cutting through some of the rhetoric. Chronic exaggeration. More chronic exaggeration? Well, to get back to what I was talking to a second ago, Gigi never had sex or tried to go on a date with a woman. He raped her. Always. He always used that word. Always. He never propositioned a woman. He, quote, tried to rape her, unquote. He threw that term around very freely and very liberally, no matter what the circumstance was. But I will point out that after he did his jail time, he toned that rhetoric down considerably. He didn't throw that phrase around nearly as much after he served jail time. Gigi never got into an argument. He never scuffled. He always beat the fuck out of someone. And conversely, he was never hit or assaulted. Somebody always beat the fuck out of him. He was always beating the fuck out of somebody, or somebody was always beating the fuck out of him. Once again, my personal experience at the SUNY Purchase show, he said in an interview that he beat the fuck out of the audience. Well, you can see it on video, guys. He charged the audience ran. That was the end of it. He never laid a hand on anybody. He did not beat the fuck out of them. The actual gig itself was wild enough, but he had to exaggerate it. At that exact same gig, he said in interviews that the police were waiting for him. He said that when he got to SUNY Purchase, that the cops were out waiting for him. They weren't. They were not. I'm sorry. There were cops, but not until somebody pulled the fire alarm and the cops showed up and looked on in some amusement as we put a leather jacket over his head and rushed him out. They never tried to interfere with us. They didn't care. They really didn't care. It's just another night at SUNY Purchase for all they knew. They did not show up beforehand, and they did not try to arrest him. In his autobiography, he does some real wild exaggerations about some of his performances. Gig in Montreal. The story that he tells in his autobiography about the gig in Montreal has zero to do with the way the actual gig went. You can watch the video of the Montreal gig, compare it to his account, and you're like, what is this guy talking about? Same thing for a gig he played in Minneapolis in 1987. What he writes about has no bearing about what actually happened at the show. And I believe that's because, A, if you look at the video of the Montreal gig, it's actually kind of lame. The crowd's really not. All right, gang, apparently we're back. I would like to thank the cruddy internet service of Newton, North Carolina, which resulted in the interruption of my GG Allin psychological report. But hey, made for a good bathroom break, right? Everybody was able to take a breather. Except me, because I had to solve the problem. But I am the hardest working man in showbiz, so whatever. We're back on. And Lord willing and the creeks don't rise, I'm going to stay on. So y'all already know the deal. I'm just going to get right back into it from where I left off, or from where the internet left me off. I was talking about how Gigi's autobiography is full of wild exaggerations, especially about his performances. The Montreal show, which he described as being the most insane, out of control thing that anybody has ever seen in their entire lives, with violence and vomiting and God only knows what, absolutely didn't go down that way. You can see the video. The video has zero to do with the way he described it. And I honestly believe that's because if you watch the video, you'll see that the audience was actually kind of lame. They really weren't into it. They weren't reacting very much. He was probably very frustrated by that. So he took control of the situation and exaggerated and presented it as being the most effed up show anybody had ever seen in their entire lives. And he kind of does the same thing with a video, with a gig from Minneapolis in 1987. The way he describes it in his book, it just seems like the world was going to end. But when you watch the video, such is not the case. In either case, the way that the show went down would have been enough for anybody. But Gigi had to exaggerate big time, which builds the image, builds the myth, and takes control of the situation. Gigi claimed that the police were waiting for him at the gig that we booked at SUNY Purchase in 1989. Not the case. The cops were not waiting for him. Nobody knew he was going to be there. We didn't know he was going to be there until the very, very, very last minute. Cops did show up, but it wasn't until after the performance. Someone tripped the fire alarm, and of course the cops came, and they kind of stood around and sort of amusedly watched while we put a leather jacket over him and kind of spirited him out. They didn't try to interfere. They just were like, okay, see ya, whoever you are, you know. They were not waiting for him. They didn't even try to arrest him. They weren't really interested. Another example of chronic exaggeration of a situation that probably didn't have to be exaggerated. He said in his autobiography that Malpractice, his original band from '77, were too raw to get bookings. What's very interesting is that if you look at the original typescript, it actually says that nobody wanted to book Malpractice because they were too original. But Gigi, by hand, crossed out the word original and wrote raw. You see it for yourself right there. The exaggeration. He claimed that he had no influences and didn't like any other bands and didn't like any other rock stars. We, of course, have seen that the exact opposite was true. He was a total fanboy, and he loved rock and roll and had plenty of influences. Some rhetoric that he tossed around a lot was heroin rhetoric. You know, he posed with needles. He had a tattoo that said heroin. He apparently did use heroin on at least a couple of occasions, but everybody who I've spoken to who really did know him and really knew him as a person said that he was not a junkie, that he was not a chronic heroin user. He was not into needle drugs. Into alcohol, yes. Bad problem with alcohol, alcoholic, absolutely, but not a junkie. And just based by my own personal observations, I mean, Gigi was a big guy. You know, he was a kind of, I wouldn't say burly, but he was like a big boned northeastern guy from New Hampshire. And, you know, watching him arm wrestle with Elvis Roy from the Disappointments, I mean, he was very well developed. It was not a junkie physique in the slightest bit. So, once again, chronic exaggeration, and I think also he was probably identifying with some of the rockers who betrayed him, such as Iggy Pop, Johnny Thunders, Steve Baders, who were junkies. He was part of that whole rock and roll mystique that he was so in love with, which of course got run through the GG Allin magnifying glass and became part of his mythology and his rhetoric. One thing that you see consistent in Gigi's life was almost complete emotional isolation. He talks about it, about when he walled himself off when confronted with psychiatrists, both in prison and when he was married. When his wife insisted that he go into therapy, he said on many times he completely walled himself off. Same thing with the psychiatrist in prison. He would let them go so far, but no further. He's saying about he was the man that you will never know. He really kept himself emotionally isolated. And that's reflected in his autobiography. His autobiography does not show any personality. It doesn't show any context for his actions. And it gives a very far complete story of his life. It's actually a very boring read. It's really dull. It's kind of like reading a police blotter for 100 pages. When you're done with it, you have no sense at all of who this guy really was or why he did what he did. There's just nothing there. It's just like page after page after page of antics. Emotionally, completely walled off. Definitely written by Gigi. Kevin would have written an entirely different book. One that Joe Coughlin would have had great use for when writing his biography. I think kind of a side note that Gigi's being completely emotionally walled off. There's a lot of his letters in circulation, of course, a lot of interviews and stuff, and people I've talked to. I can't think of a single example where he uses the term "I love you" or "I'm sorry," or hardly even a sincere thank you. I can think of one example where he does thank the murder junkies on stage for sticking with him. And even then he says something to the effect of, well, I suppose I have to thank my band. It's like, well, I really don't want it, but I guess I have to. And I only know of one example ever when Gigi apologized to somebody. A story told to me by Jeff Clayton from Anti-Scene. No thank yous, no I'm sorries, no I love yous. Completely emotionally walled off. Terms of endearment are just not in his vocabulary. So a couple of other odds and ends that he was consistent about through his entire life. He had a habit of saving all of his bodily fluids in baggies and bottles and refrigerators. Also, the bodily fluids of others. He'd bottle them up, bag them up, and stick them in the fridge. What that means, I have no idea. Also consistent, at least from his early career in the Jabbers, was that the guy never bathed. Steve, the guitar player from the Jabbers, has a YouTube channel of his own, and he talks about how even in the very early days of the Jabbers, Gigi never bathed. He'd play a show and come home covered in stale beer, blood, dirt, broken glass, whatever, but he wouldn't clean up. And of course, Gigi wore that as a real badge of honor later in his life, that's kind of what makes me think that he suffered from body odor when he was a kid, because it's very consistent. Somebody who's taking a weakness and turning it into a strength would do that with their own body odor, I would think. You know, oh, you think I smell bad? Check this out. I never bathe. F you. Consistent. And I saw with my own two eyes when he had a chance to take a nice hot shower, but absolutely refused to. The other guys in his band, the Disappointments, gleefully took advantage of having a hot shower for the first time in God knows how long. GG said, showering's for pussies, and continued to sit there in his own juices, possibly trying to cover up his own natural body odor. More exaggeration, more turning a weakness into a strength. He also had, as you could probably guess, wild mood swings. And my favorite example of that that's documented is the video of his performance from Milwaukee in 1989, the one that got him put in jail in the first place. Over the course of like a 1 hour video, you see him go from almost manic happiness to absolutely crushing depression. You see it with your own two eyes. Wild mood swing. And of course, depression was a key element of his personality. You know, there's an interview from 1986 where he mentions having recently attempted suicide. And of course, there's his claim that he was going to commit suicide on stage years later. Another example of taking a weakness and making it into a strength. About wanting to kill yourself, being so depressed you want to kill yourself, and turning that into a badge of honor, a manifesto, something you have complete control over and not being a helpless victim of. Absolutely consistent. So there you go, guys. That's close to 100 minutes of my speculation about GG Allin and the consistencies in his life and the reasons for his doing what he did. What do the experts say? What do real psychiatrists have to say? Well, we're very fortunate in that we have 2 psychiatric reports from his prison years that are available. According to one of his prison psychiatric evaluations from early 1990, the psychiatrist said that GG did not have a history of psychiatric illness. In other words, he was not mentally ill. He took a test called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is used for incoming prisoners. According to this practitioner, his test results did not indicate mental illness. Nor, this guy said, did they appear to diagnose any personality disorders. According to that one analysis, to paraphrase the actual report, psychiatrists classified him as a dominant personality type, angry and hostile, grandiose and egocentric, also irritable, excited, and energetic with a paranoid component, who finds comprehension of human behavior and motives difficult to understand. That's one. Now, there's another report from late 1989 in which a psychiatrist suggests mixed personality disorder, in which the sufferer has a number of personality disorders going on in their head. And there's a couple of different types of mixed personality disorders. An educated guess says that GG had cluster B type personality disorder. A cluster B personality disorder causes a person to behave in an excessively dramatic way, to be volatile, and to have wild, exaggerated mood swings. And there are 4 different personality disorders in the cluster B. Number 1 is borderline personality disorder, in which a fear of abandonment drives a person to anger, self-harm, and unstable moods. Part of cluster B is antisocial personality disorder, in which the sufferer acts impulsively, ignores societal norms, and exhibits a strong temper. Another part of Class B is narcissistic personality disorder, in which the sufferer is driven by a sense of low self-worth, a sense of entitlement, hypersensitivity to criticism, and a lack of or absence of empathy towards the feelings of others. Number 4 in Class B is histrionic personality disorder, in which a person seeks attention, obsesses over physical appearance, and has trouble maintaining serious relationships. Does that sound like anybody we've been talking about for the last 100 minutes? I leave it up to you. Now, it's really important that a personality disorder is not the same as mental illness. Mental illness is a chemical imbalance in your brain that you were born with. A personality disorder is the result of experiences in one's life, as I understand it. But a personality disorder is not mental illness. Now, the doctor who came up with the cluster B personality disorder did not recommend psychiatric intervention, but he did recommend psychotherapy and treatment for alcoholism. And that's kind of where we leave it for the professional opinions. I'm just going to throw out a couple more possibilities that might explain a few things. Somebody raised this, and I thought it was very intriguing. Very intriguing. We've seen plenty of evidence, and I think it's safe to say that GG Allin was bisexual. I think he was fully bisexual. He stated on a number of occasions that he was attracted to men and women, and certainly acted on that throughout his entire life. But what if GG was a transgender woman? In one of the psychiatric reports, GG, quote, he acknowledged often wishing that he were a girl just because of the clothes they get to wear, unquote. And I was told point blank by somebody who knew GG very well that GG said he wished he was a woman. So you throw a transgender woman into all that, that adds a whole new light to things. But once again, that's just speculation. I don't really know. And the final possibility, which is very likely, is undiagnosed mental illness. Big possibility, a big vote could be made for post-trauma stress disorder and or bipolar disorder, like full-blown mentally ill bipolar. So that's kind of what we got. That's the opinions of the professionals. That's my speculation as a very interested fanboy of almost 40 years. And I want to say that I was able to do this for the last almost 2 hours by standing on the shoulders of giants. I want to thank everybody I talked to over the years who really knew Gigi, who worked with him, who had a good understanding of him, and who shared their stories and their experiences with me. Thank you guys, all of you. A lot of you didn't want to be named, so I'm just not going to name anybody. But if you're watching this, you know who you are, and I am most grateful to you for sharing with me and making this happen. This is something that's been on my chest for a long time, and I'm glad I finally got to get it out and present it to everybody out there. And I'm grateful to everybody who's watched and listened and has something to say about it. I'll be checking the comments most avidly to see who's got what to say about what. I'm looking forward to a good dialogue and hopefully more information and more knowledge about what it was that made GG Allin tick. As for me, I'm Malcolm Tent. I'm your host on Tent Talks Tunes, brought to you every Wednesday live on my Facebook page and archived forever on my YouTube channel. Please check it out. Please subscribe. Please watch what I do until your eyeballs fall right out. As far as it stands right now, I do hope to be back in about 167 hours time live on the Facebook. So until we meet again, this is Malcolm Tent saying so long from the Tar Heel State.